Hello everyone, my name is Tori Miller, and I will be introducing you to the Buck v. Bell Supreme Court case. To start, I will be giving background on the case. In all of the cases leading up to the Supreme Court case, and in the Supreme Court case itself, Carrie Buck is the plaintiff. Carrie Elizabeth Buck was raised by her foster parents since she was 3 years old due to her biological mother being deemed a low-grade moron and feeble-minded by the authorities in 1920. Shortly after, Carrie Buck would be subjected to the same fate as her mother, because in 1923, Carrie became pregnant as a result of rape. It was later revealed that she was raped by her foster parents' own nephew, and despite this, her foster parents still believed the pregnancy was evidence of promiscuity and feeble-mindedness, and therefore they filed a petition to the court to have Carrie institutionalized. After giving birth to her child Vivian, Carrie Buck was consigned to the Virginia colony in 1924. In the picture, you can see Carrie Buck on the right. You can see Carrie Buck on the left. In that same year, in March of 1924, the Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act was signed into law, and it stated that in certain cases, inmates of any institution could be sterilized if the institution's board found that the patient was idiotic, insane, feeble-minded, epileptic, or an imbecile. This pertained to Carrie Buck because she was just deemed feeble-minded and therefore institutionalized to the Virginia colony. In the middle, you can see a picture of Albert Priddy, who is the defendant in the first case. Albert Priddy is the first superintendent of the Virginia colony. After the passing of the sterilization law, he compiled a list of candidates that he recommended for sterilization, and Carrie Buck was one of the women on that list. But before Albert Priddy could perform the surgeries of sterilization, he wanted to test the new law's constitutionality in the courts. Therefore, he tabled all of the sterilization orders except for Carrie Buck's. In response to this, Robert Sheldon, Carrie Buck's state-appointed guardian, appealed the sterilization order to the Amherst County Circuit Court, and this is where the case became Buck v. Priddy. In November of 1924, testimony was heard in the case of Buck v. Priddy. Aubrey Strode defended the colony, and Irving Whitehead represented Carrie Buck. Aubrey Strode called expert witnesses to the stand to testify about the science of eugenics. One of these witnesses was Dr. Joseph Spencer Desjarnette, who claimed that feeble-mindedness runs in families. Since Carrie Buck's mother was labeled feeble-minded, and Carrie was too, Priddy argued that Buck's daughter Vivian would follow suit. Priddy and his team argued that they could stop this cycle by having Carrie Buck sterilized and then released back into society. Another expert witness that Strode utilized was Harry Laughlin. Laughlin presented the Stanford-Binet IQ test scores of Carrie and her mother. Carrie's mental age was 9 years old and her mother's was almost 8 years old. According to Harry Laughlin, anyone who scored between the age of 6 and 9 years was deemed an imbecile. This further proved Albert Priddy and his team's point that feeble-mindedness was genetic. After Aubrey Strode presented his evidence, Buck's attorney, Irving Whitehead, offered no rebuttal to his argument. In April of 1925, the court ruled in favor of Albert Priddy. Judge Gordon stated that since feeble-mindedness is hereditary, Carrie Buck was at risk of creating socially inadequate offspring, and thus Carrie Buck should be sterilized. In January of 1925, Albert Priddy, the first superintendent of the colony, died, and therefore John Hendren Bell became the colony's new superintendent, and thus he was named to the next court case, and it became Buck v. Bell. The Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals upheld the Amherst County Circuit Court ruling in Buck v. Bell on November 12, 1925. They claimed that the sterilization of Carrie Buck was legal and necessary. However, Carrie Buck appealed this decision and stated it violated her 14th Amendment right, and therefore the case moved to the United States Supreme Court in 1927.
The Virginia courts ruled in favor of Bell, and the question brought to the Supreme Court was, did the Virginia Act authorizing sterilization deny Buck the right to due process of the law and the equal protection of laws which are protected by the 14th Amendment? The court found that this statute did not violate the Constitution's 14th Amendment. The legal reasoning behind this decision was explained by Aubrey Strode, who represented the institution. It was explained that the Act did allow for due process rights, and the sterilization of patients is only implemented when seen fit. Sterilization was also explained to not be cruel and unusual punishment. With the 8-1 decision, the majority opinion was explained by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. The opinion was clearly explained in less than 3 pages. Under the precedent set in the Supreme Court case Jacobson v. Massachusetts, the sterilization of Carrie Buck would be implemented under the principle of compulsory vaccination. This was seen as broad enough to cut a woman's fallopian tubes and apply to this case. The sterilization should not take place until a hearing occurred determining how important or necessary it would be for Buck to have this done. Observations had to be done to come to the final decision. Additionally, in that process, the patient and guardian could be present. This is part of what confirmed to the courts that the sterilization of Buck would be constitutional. The motive behind the Virginia Act on sterilization and how it applies to this case is explained when Holmes stated, quote, "Instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough," end quote. The decision was made to protect the overall public welfare and explain that the lowest members of society should not expect the best citizens to take care of the potential harm that could come. Justice Pierce Butler was the justice who voted against the other 8 justices, but no opinion was given or written.
The next part of our project relates to the historical context surrounding the Buck v. Bell Supreme Court ruling. What is eugenics? Negative eugenics is the belief that by using genetic science, you could do away with human biological and physiological issues for future generations using things such as selective breeding and sterilization. It is an ideology that was seen on a large scale during the Holocaust in Germany, when Nazis pushed for compulsory sterilization and the murder of the institutionalized disabled in the clandestine euthanasia program. On the left, you can see a diagram that kind of gives more information about what people who believed in eugenics thought. So, unfit human traits such as feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, criminality, insanity, alcoholism, pauperism, and many others run in families and are inherited in exactly the same way as color in guinea pigs. So what people who believed in eugenics believed was that these traits that were seen as negative were passed down hereditarily, and that using eugenic ideologies, these things could be breeded out in 3 generations. On the right, you can see another diagram. This was passed around during the 1920s when the eugenics movement was at its peak. It just basically shows like a tree, like a family tree, and stuff that goes into like the greatness of eugenics. History of eugenics. The theory of eugenics first appeared in 1883 when Francis Galton coined the term eugenics while supporting society pushing the fittest individuals to get married and breed by providing them with payment for doing so. So he believed that citizens that passed eugenics tests and were proven to be great for breeding should be paid to get married and then breed with each other. So if you had a male that had no disabilities, no disorders, nothing like that, and a female that was the same way, he wanted governments and countries to pay these 2 individuals to get married and have children so that their offspring would in turn not have any mental disorders or disabilities, which nowadays we know that disabilities and mental disorders don't necessarily work like that and cannot be breeded out. Cards like the one below were given out by the American Eugenics Society to individuals and couples that reached a perfect hereditary standard for breeding. So down on the right, it says, Eugenic Certificate. This guarantees that I have examined the gender of the sender of this card and find a perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. So people would submit their information to be judged by the American Eugenics Society, and they would in turn receive this certificate if they were fit to breed. The American Eugenics Society held conventions to push their agenda with infographics such as the one below on the left stating, "Some people are born to be a burden on the rest. Learn about hereditary. You can help correct these conditions." You can also see in the middle one of the conventions that they would hold. At the top it says Eugenic and Health Exhibit. held by the American Eugenics Society, and lots of people would come to hear about the so science of eugenics. Nowadays, eugenics is seen more as a pseudoscience, but back in the 1920s, eugenics was considered cold, hard scientific fact. How eugenics relates to the Buck v. Bell case. So in the photo on the left, we can see Carrie Buck, and on the right, we can see her mother, Emma Buck. The state of Virginia believed that Carrie needed to be sterilized to prevent her feeble-mindedness from being further spread to any other offspring. The state of Virginia believed that Carrie Buck's mother, Emma Buck, passed her feeble-mindedness to Carrie Buck, and in turn, Carrie passed feeble-mindedness to her daughter, Vivian Buck. This belief was fueled by the eugenics movement and the overall fear of mental illness and disabilities at the time. After the Buck v. Bell ruling was passed, siding with Bell, Carrie Buck and her sister Dawn Buck were both involuntarily sterilized to prevent the spread of feeble-mindedness.
All right, so I'm just going to be adding on to some more context of the Supreme Court case, Bell versus Buck, and I'll just be discussing some of the consequences of the Supreme Court ruling that weren't expected. So Carrie Buck was the first, but after her 8,300 Virginians underwent involuntary forced sterilization, this was until the practice was stopped in the 1970s, and these are just numbers reported in Virginia. Scientific communities condemned eugenic practices in 1936, so this meant that they were deeming eugenic practices unfit for society and were trying to eliminate it, but this was not stopped until the 1970s. Over 60,000 forced sterilizations were performed in the United States after the Supreme Court's ruling in the Bell versus Buck case, and these are just numbers reported in the United States. Involuntary sterilization was mainly practiced on people of lower socioeconomic status and African American individuals, and typically these individuals were in mental hospitals and, like I stated, had lower socioeconomic status, but still in the mental hospitals, African American individuals were targeted more often for eugenic practices. Some more consequences of the Supreme Court ruling. Nazi efforts progressed Pseudo-American works. So due to the American publications that eugenics was doing so well in the United States, Nazi Germany took that and kind of ran with it and saw it as an acceptable social policy and started implementing their own eugenic practices. And eugenics was really brought in mainly by this image on the left-hand side, and it says that only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics. So they saw hereditary diseases as unfit for society, like feeble-mindedness and other mental health issues that they really didn't have a lot of knowledge about, and were trying to eliminate it to make a fit society. Ultimately, 360,000 to 375,000 individuals were involuntarily sterilized in just Germany, and this was just during Nazi Germany. And going once again back to how Americans kind of progressed this, the Nazis, when proposing their own sterilization program, specifically noted the success of sterilization laws in California. So it really was kind of an issue of the U.S. that kind of progressed Nazi Germany into performing their own eugenic practices. The Eugenics Records Office and the Nazi program aligned in their stated goals in that they wanted a fit society and they wanted to get rid of individuals that they deemed that had hereditary diseases. So the main lesson in all of this is that where science appears to validate folk beliefs, it needs to be subjected to more harsh scrutiny than ordinary sciences. So they didn't have a lot of knowledge about mental health and other hereditary diseases, and they didn't take the time to research them before they just started saying that these individuals couldn't have children. So it needed more harsh scrutiny and more research in order for things like this to not happen. So restating our question from earlier, did the act in Virginia authorizing sterilization deny Buck the right to due process of the law and the equal protection of the laws, which are protected by the 14th Amendment? So that's the main question for this case. And then the affirming versus challenging vote. So the affirming vote is that Carrie Buck was given due process of the law and equal protection of the law under the 14th Amendment. And the challenging vote is that Carrie Buck was denied her right to due process of the law and equal protection of the law under the 14th Amendment. And then these are some of our references, and thank you for watching our presentation.